This morning. I'm so glad to see you here this morning. I'll start with a story, as I often do, from the Middle East, from our time that we had in serving in the Middle East. And when I was there, I learned the story of an amazingly generous but very poor man. And this man had a prized horse. This horse drew the attention of all of those people around, even the ruler of the country. The horse was the man's prized possession, really the only thing that he had that was worth anything. Even so, the ruler wanted to buy this horse. So he made a visit to the poor man. In the customary way of the Middle East, the man invited the ruler in. They had tea and they talked at length, and eventually a sumptuous meal was served by the poor man, and then they got to the business at hand. That's the way it happens in the Middle East. The business comes after food and drink and socialization. The ruler explained, "The reason I've come today is that I've heard of the amazing horse that you have, and I'd like to make you a very rich man. I'd like to buy your horse." The poor man thought for a moment, and then he replied, "I'm afraid that's impossible. You've just eaten him." I told this story to a friend of mine in Arabic. I worked through it in Arabic, and I had heard this story, and here I am talking to a group of my Arab friends, and I told this to them, and they said, "This is true. This is a true story." And I was amazed, because here I had taken it as a fable, as a story, which nonetheless is valuable because it tells of the generosity of the Middle Eastern people. But he said, "No, this is actually a true story." Well, whether it's true or not, we're going to be touching on something very similar here today, as it is in Luke chapter 2, the birth of Jesus, as it's recorded there. So let's look to begin at Caesar's voter registration, our first point here for today. I invite you to turn in your Bibles to Luke chapter 2, where I'll be reading from the English Standard Version. I mentioned last week that the English Standard Version is in the same line of translations from the King James. And so if you find some similarities in the wording of the King James, now you know why. In fact, one of those wordings, as we get to the end of the chapter here, the end of the passage here today, will be one of those things. You will find it very familiar. This is the way it comes from the King James, that carryover. So let's read here together, and we'll read right from verse 1 of chapter 2. In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria. And all went to be registered, each to his own town. And Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child. And while they were there, the time came for her to give birth, and she gave birth to her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the inn. May the Lord bless his word to our hearing today. Of course, today's passage focuses on the birth of Jesus, which contains a lot of traditional elements that we carry in our worship even today. From this passage alone, we have the idea of Joseph and Mary making their way into Bethlehem in the dead of winter. That's in our tradition, right? Just in the nick of time as Mary is about to deliver. Joseph checks in at the Motel 6, but unfortunately there are no rooms available, and so they are sent to the stable where Mary gives birth to all alone, and puts the baby in a manger. Now, today, I'm going to mess with tradition. I hope everyone walks out of here with a clearer picture of what would have happened 2,000 years ago, but that's going to take a little messing with tradition of what happened in Israel. The whole scene starts with this decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. Of course, by all the world, this only means all the relevant world to those who are reading Luke's Gospels. We wouldn't expect the residents of Tasmania or Greenland to go to their ancestral cities of origin in the Middle East or North Africa to register for the Roman taxation. Well, that's the other important thing about this registration. It was not a pleasant event of rejoicing for the people of Israel. Rather, it was a symbol of their subservience to the Roman Empire. The whole purpose of this registration was more taxation. As if it wasn't enough what they're already paying, they wanted to get an accurate count of all the people so that they could levy more taxes on the people. Money was forcefully collected, and the people of Israel were not happy about it. They weren't even given the option of registering by absentee ballot. They had to show up in person, which meant that a lot of other people were traveling too. As we look at verse 2, I'll point out something again that I've pointed out before. If this whole story was a fabrication by Jesus' disciples, and that is a claim even today, that some people say that Jesus was a legend, that his disciples just made him up to be something that he wasn't. Well, if that would be the case, it includes far too much detail. I mean, why in verse 2 are we reading about the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria? If this story was made up, who cares how many registrations were made by Quirinius or even any other governor of Rome? You'd find something like, once upon a time, in a land far away. You wouldn't find unrelated details that could be fact-checked and used to falsify the record if it were a fictional story. Instead, what we have here is a detail that allows us to mark the time of Jesus' birth. And to be candid, that's a bit of a challenge here. The made-up stories don't include challenges to the narrative, but here is a challenge, and here's the resolution. We know through the Jewish historian Josephus that Quirinius was governor of Syria from around AD 6 to AD 9. Now, did you note that? AD 6 to AD 9. That's years after Jesus was born. So how do we reconcile that when obviously Luke is referring to a time, actually it's 4 or 5 BC that we're talking. So we're talking a 10-year gap here. How do we reconcile that? You see, if something is made up in a fictional story, it's not going to include details that would oppose the narrative that's here. Well, he wouldn't say the first census. Luke wouldn't say the first census unless there was a second census. And so it is very reasonable to understand that Quirinius was governor 2 different times. One from 6 to 9 AD, the other one from 6 to 4 BC. And that's what we find. So why would he say there was a first registration? Well, that was because this one refers to before Jesus was born. This is the time before Jesus was born. And then later on, Josephus refers to the one that comes after. You see how we can find the details in there if we're persistent and if we read that carefully. But if it were a fake story, if it were just fiction, you'd have once upon a time in a land far, far away. You wouldn't have these sort of details. So don't be so quick to dismiss. Don't follow that line that other people will say, well, this is all legend. Just dismiss this, and here's an example. No, don't be so quick to dismiss the accuracy of the biblical record. Luke was very careful about what he included. And why would he have any impetus to include anything but the story as it was? When we only know of the census of Quirinius in AD 6, well, now Luke includes information that records a census from AD 4 or 5 in that time frame. The major question this leaves us as we consider the birth of Jesus is how this tiny town of Bethlehem relates to prophecy and the secular government of Rome. The Messiah was prophesied by Micah to be born in Bethlehem. Now, Micah lived 700 years before these events happened, before Jesus was around. So we have to ask ourselves, before the Roman government even existed, when Micah made this prophecy, did God control secular governments and 700 years of history to establish the Roman government so that his people, Mary and Joseph, would move from Galilee to Bethlehem in order to register so that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem? Yes. Yes, God controls all of those details that we can look at now. We look at in hindsight and we say, man, that just seems too perfect to be the case. But it was written in Micah before 700 years before any of these events came about. When we ask questions like this, we have to be careful to recognize that A didn't cause B and B didn't happen because of A. So no, I'm not going to say that God is responsible for all the atrocities that the Roman government did. But did he use those for his glory? Did he use those in order to establish the truth of the prophecy from Micah 700 years ago? Absolutely he did. So when we look at the gruesome rule of Caesar Augustus, who would be in power at this time, and his thirst for more power and thirst for more money so that he would issue a decree that all the people would be taxed and that they would have to go to their ancestral hometowns. Would God use that in order to take Mary and Joseph into Bethlehem? Yes, he certainly did. And he certainly fulfilled Micah's prophecy. This isn't incidental. You can't say that this is just an accident. It just happened to be that way. This is by the creator of the universe who controls all of those events, even secular governments. So God did not passively look at the way that things would pan out and he decided, well, okay, I think this is going to happen, and so I'm going to have Micah write down that he's going to be born in Bethlehem. No, God controlled all of those pieces. The fact is that God is outside of space and time so that he is not limited by space and time like we are. So that he could simultaneously see all that happens in space and time. Your brain, my brain, is too small to see things the way that God sees them. But God knows how all things will play out. He sees things as they are right now. He knows all of it. He doesn't learn anything like we do. He doesn't progress. He doesn't age like we do. God is outside of space and time. Well, Caesar Augustus was the Caesar who brought about Pax Romana. You might have heard of this. It's the Roman peace. Peace over the whole Roman Empire. And it is said that Caesar Augustus, that he came to Rome that was made of brick, and he left it a Rome made of marble. He did a lot for Rome. did God cause this great government, this Roman government, to be in place through Caesar Augustus so that a census would be taken to compel Joseph and Mary to be in Bethlehem at this time? Yes, to fulfill a prophecy. For us, establishing one of the most powerful and expansive empires of all time, that seems like a big deal. For God, just another prophecy. Just another prophecy to check mark. Yep, done that. It's over. It's fulfilled. I controlled all the things that came up to that. Does that wake you up in any way to the magnitude of the awesome nature of God? For me, it does. Come and see in an Airbnb. So here's our second point, free Airbnb. That's in fact what Joseph's ancestors gave him, free Airbnb for all eternity. I guess we could put it into a little rhyme there, couldn't we? When I watch movies, I completely avoid horror movies. I just have no taste for horror movies. I rarely watch gratuitous violence. I will occasionally watch a rom-com. But if the story is a true story of valor and courage, yes, I'll watch war. For example, true stories like Hacksaw Ridge are worth enduring just for the models of bravery and courage that they exhibit, or Saving Private Ryan. Another of those films was Lone Survivor, which tells the story of Pashtun Wali. You can see this here. Pashtun Wali is a principal in Afghanistan that my friend whom you've met here, who's still being held by the Taliban and has been since January of this past year. Please pray for him. Pray for his release. Pashtun Wali, I asked him about this, and I asked him specifically about this movie, Lone Survivor, and he said, yes, Pashtun Wali, this principle of generosity, of caring for your guests, is alive and well today. It really is deeply ingrained in the Afghan people. Now, in the movie Lone Survivor, the U.S. Navy SEAL, Marcus Luttrell, you see a picture of him there, he was the only survivor of his 4-person SEAL team that was ambushed in Afghanistan. He was severely injured when he was found by an Afghan villager named Mohammed Ghalab. Ghalab had sheltered and protected Luttrell from the Taliban. So yes, you heard that right. He was an Afghan villager, but he saw Marcus Luttrell as his guest, and so he sheltered him from the Taliban. And then he sent to a U.S. base to arrange for his rescue. This true story demonstrates the deep value placed on care for one's guests, just as my story from Oman did at the beginning. The point of bringing in these stories is that Joseph and Mary would have benefited from the same honorable hospitality that Marcus Luttrell experienced. This is where we break down one of those traditions of Christmas. There's no way that Joseph, a descendant of the house of David, in the kingly line of David, would have been turned away from any house in Bethlehem, especially with a young woman who is great with child, right? As the saying goes, Bethlehem is the way the city would have been referred to by others, but we know that the people that were close to this little hamlet, they referred to it as the city of David because they took honor and pride in it being the city of David, that all of them were descendants of David. So they were proud of their city, and anyone who presented himself saying, I am Joseph, son of Heli, son of Mathat, the son of Levi, would have immediately been welcomed into their home. It would have brought unspeakable shame to the entire village if a descendant of David was not shown hospitality with his pregnant wife. So I have no doubt that Joseph and Mary were immediately provided a place to sleep. Now, what do we make then of the fact that there was no room for them in the inn? Well, let's take a look at the layout of a typical home in Bethlehem at this time. So you can kind of see in this diagram here, no room in the kataluma. That's the Greek word that's there. So we want to know, what does that mean? Now, on the left-hand side, if you can't read it, I'll explain it here. On the left-hand side is the entrance. There's the door, and it goes into the stable. What would be, it's kind of a temporary stable. It's not where animals were kept all day or anything like this, but rather overnight. A few of the animals would be kept in the stable. And then there would be mangers that were actually carved into the ground, into the rock of the ground, a little place where you would put hay and straw and oats and whatever that might need to be there. And then that was really in the family area. There were really one-room homes. That's how you should think about it. Even though there are 3 rooms here, the family area, the place where everything was done by the family, was right there in the middle. And you had to go up a certain number of steps in order to get there. Probably just 3 or 4 steps in order to get into the family area. But then there were probably a few more steps that you would go up into the guest room, the kataluma. That's where the guests would be. It was really reserved just for guests. And the reason for this was nobody else slept there. They didn't do other things there. And the reason for this was so that they could always entertain guests. So that someone could just drop in at any moment. There were no cell phones. Nobody sending a text message in advance saying, hey, I'm going to show up on December 23rd. Is that okay if I stay at your place? They would show up at any time. And so this guest room was reserved for them on the far right there. That was the upper room. A lot of this information comes from Kenneth Bailey's book, Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes, which in fact is referred to as a primary source by Lee Strobel in the chapter that we were reading this week. So all of this information comes together even from the Advent book that we're reading together. Now, Kenneth Bailey, he would know. He spent 40 years living and teaching in the New Testament in Egypt and Lebanon and Jerusalem and Cyprus. He taught in all of those different places. He was a pastor in those different places. He's one of my favorite authors to read on cultural studies of the Middle East. So you can picture what one of these homes would have looked like. The center of it being the family room where everything was done, where everybody slept in the same room. That's where you ate, that's where you played, that's where you slept. It all happened there. And yes, it would be an occasional sheep that would walk up the stairs into the family room. That was just part of the mix of things. In this particular context, we can understand that Mary and Joseph were not turned away from the family when they asked for help, but the family actually went an extra mile and said, well, our guest room is full. The kataluma has no room. There is no room in the inn. That's the way the King James translates it, and that's why we have that idea in our mind today. But it's really a guest room is what we're talking about. There's no room in the inn, but we're going to go the extra mile and allow you to sleep right in our family room with the rest of us right here. So that's the picture that I want you to have in your mind. Not that these people were turning them away, but rather they were going the extra mile and welcoming Mary and Joseph in. And so they allowed them to sleep there in their family room. But as we know the story, there wasn't much sleeping going on the night that Mary gave birth. Joseph and Mary were not forced to sleep in a stable with the cows and the sheep. That being said, the cows and the sheep were immediately next to them, right? And so the manger that would be there, it was in a perfect place for, yes, the baby to be put into clean straw in a manger. Well, looking at all of this then, was it a strange and wonderful thing that a visiting woman from Galilee gave birth during Joseph's registration with the Roman government? Yes. That was extraordinary. But were they denied entry and left out in a cold stable? No. They were welcomed into the home to be cared for by the rest of the family. After all, they were descendants of King David. Come and see in an Airbnb. That leads us to humble beginnings for the king. Verse 6 says this. You can read along with me here. And while they were there, the time came for her to give birth. And she gave birth to her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling cloths, and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the inn. As we read that, I hope the shock value of this scene is not lost on you. To place a newborn baby in a manger sounds absurd. It sounds unthinkable. Don't let your familiarity with the story remove how odd this was and how amazing it was. The humble beginnings for the King of all kings. On the other hand, I enjoy thinking about the industriousness of Joseph. I mean, think about it. Joseph looked at the situation that they were in and made the best of what they had without regard to how absurd it might seem to others. Mary had given birth to this little baby, so Joseph is trying to make himself useful using his skills as a carpenter. He's probably asking himself, oh, what should I do in this scenario? I can't go out and make a manger or something, or a bassinet or something, so I'll just make this right here out of this little divot in the ground. I'll clean that out. I mean, I don't doubt that he cleaned it out, put fresh straw in there, but then put this wrapped up little baby right in that manger. Mary has a cute little bassinet right next to her where she is sleeping. I appreciate the industrious nature of Joseph in this. Joseph is not sitting in a corner begrudging the fact that I can't believe this. God, I'm a descendant of King David, and I'm stuck here like this. I mean, she's not even married to me, right? It's not my child. Oh, God, I just can't believe this. Why would you treat me this way, Lord? No, that's not Joseph. That's not Joseph. I mean, I got some things that I can learn from Joseph in this. He's thinking, how can I make this situation reasonable, since this is what the Lord has given us? I think it's unlikely that Joseph and Mary thought through the prophecies at that time and said, oh, the Messiah must be born in Bethlehem. We shall endure all that comes our way for that sake. No, I don't think they put those pieces together until probably well after the case. You know, maybe even after Jesus was presented in the temple, and all of the prophecy from Simeon and all of these different things were brought to bear. I don't think they thought about this until after the fact. They had to deal with things as they were. They had to deal with the absurd situation of putting a little baby to bed in a manger. And Joseph looked at the situation he was in and thought of how he could make the best of it. How could he make a cute little story out of the child's birth? By making a nice, clean little manger bassinet so that his fiancée wouldn't feel so bad about her situation. I can learn a lot from that attitude. Instead of bemoaning bad things that happen to me, I can learn a lot from making a cute little manger bassinet. The last thing we learn from this passage comes from the last word of the passage. There was no place for them in the inn. And this is that carryover, as I mentioned, from the King James Version that really gives us the idea that there's some Motel 6 there with lots of different rooms that we're trying to check in at. It gives us the idea that they were rented out for the night so that they were put into a stable because there were no more rooms available. Is that the idea that we should have? Well, There's a word for that sort of inn, but that's not the word that's used here. You're probably familiar with the context that that word is used, and that's in the story of the Good Samaritan that takes place in Luke chapter 10. It says this: "He went over to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on olive oil and wine. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him." So we do see that word, but that's not what's used here. There's the Bible's Motel 6. Here in Luke chapter 2, a different word is used, and I think it has a great deal of meaning in the life of Jesus. Here you can see, we've already seen the layout of a typical home in Israel at this time. People entered into the home through what served as an overnight stable for a few of the animals. They would go up a few stairs into the family room, and then they would go up a few more stairs into the upper room. This served exclusively as a guest room, as I mentioned. And you've got to ask yourself, why was there a stable in the middle of this area? Why did the people keep an oxen or sheep in close proximity like this? Well, keep in mind, there were no furnaces. What would they use? They would use their own animals to keep the rest of the house warm. So when you went up a few steps to the family room, and then you went up a few more steps to get into the upper room, where was the warmest place in the house? It was in the upper room, the guest room. That warmth that came up from those sheep that were down 2 levels here, that radiated through the house, and the warmest place to be would be where the guests were put. In Luke chapter 22, we do read this word in a different way. Jesus says to his disciples, "Tell the owner of the house, the teacher asks you, where is the guest room where I can eat the Passover with my disciples? Then he will show you a large, unfurnished room upstairs. Make the preparations there." Jesus began his earthly life when there was no room for them in the upper room. Jesus finished his earthly life focusing on and sharing the Passover meal with his disciples in the upper room. The very same word. I don't think that's accidental. The beginning and the end, the bookends of Jesus' life are surround this guest room. What is the wonder of salvation that God has prepared for you? Come and see in an Airbnb. So what are you going to do about this? Is there going to be anything that changes in your heart, in your life? Maybe you'll look at your circumstances a little bit differently. Maybe you'll encourage, maybe you'll tell somebody else that you can take a different perspective. The perspective is all up to you. Are you going to begrudge the path that God has you on and the place that you are on? Or are you going to be like Joseph and say, I think I'll make a little manger bassinet? Let's pray. Lord Jesus, thank you for this example of faith from Joseph and Mary. Lord, thank you for the place of humble beginnings that all of us can identify with. Lord, none of us have to look to a great king, and none of us are feeling excluded because we weren't born into greatness. We can all connect with the humble beginnings of Jesus. None of us started out lower. And Lord, it was through the simple care of a manger bassinet, going the extra mile of a family whose house was full, that now they offered it to be more full, and to have this little baby, your son, be born in their midst. Thank you so much for what we can learn from this story. In Jesus' name.